There was a critic that came into my studio once, and he said, it didn't sink in till later, but he said, I feel like I could explain this piece to somebody and without them ever seeing it, and they would completely understand it. And it didn't even seem like a criticism, it was like one of those things that, oh, okay. But then I thought about it later. I thought that was probably the harshest criticism I've had of any piece, because he was saying essentially that this piece doesn't need to exist. That's a pretty harsh criticism, and he was right. It was a terrible piece, but that's, why does it even need to exist? What is it doing that's unique to anything else? Why does it need to exist in this world? Now, those are questions that every artist needs to ask. Why am I spending so much time making all this stuff? Because it's a complicated world with a lot of problems, and art is not going to really solve any of them in and of itself, but it does, I think, enrich us as human beings and makes us sensitive to real issues in a way that other things cannot. So it doesn't address the problem, it addresses the person and the individual, that then we as human beings have potential to try to be better people. Maybe one thing that continues through all of my work is this idea of constraints. I love constraints. See, we're surrounded by constraints every day. We all have to have a certain amount of sleep. We're constrained by gravity. We're constrained by the time in the day. We live in constraint all the time. And for me, constraint for some people has a negative connotation. For me, it's very positive. Constraints can be really comforting. As an artist, it gives you something to push up against. So it gives me a tool to help make creative decisions. The constraints make us stronger. You don't develop unless you run up against some sort of resistance. So resistance is essential. In some ways, I'm not really developing anything new. It's just trying to exploit the constraints that we live within, to bring them to our attention, so we look at them a little bit differently. I'm incapable of just making an aesthetic decision just on a gut level. I think it always has to go back to the constraint. So if I want to change something, instead of just changing it aesthetically, I go back and I change the constraint to allow that to happen. So it's setting up a rationale or a set of boundaries for myself to work within, and then I follow my own rules. So I make up my own rules and then I follow them. It's a conceptual approach, but I think that's where the difference is for me, is that I'm not interested in separating the conceptual from the aesthetic. It's not that separation. Setting up a constraint keeps the two united. It keeps the aesthetic and the conceptual united, where they become indistinguishable, because the aesthetic is always is always tied somehow to the concept. It's flowing right out of the idea. And then in turn, it supports the concept, and the two support each other. You know, the constraint essentially with John Henry, I mean, pressing books between the walls. Essentially, that's the overarching constraint of John Henry, is pressing books between the walls so they self-support. So everything else that came after that, every decision that was made to support that idea. So the constraint is that. So I can't hide anything, and I was very aware of that. I can't hide anything, because that's just, then it becomes a prop. It's no longer about the process. It's no longer about this, you know, it doesn't reference feats of strength, you know, strong man, you know, people like with the tug of war with the elephant, like those ridiculous feats of strength. You know, it has a lot of references. That piece for me has a lot of references. And of course the John Henry folktale. It usually starts out with something really simple. In fact, that piece, I had this really cheap IKEA bookshelf, and I was jamming books into the bookshelf. And I noticed when, you know, you kind of get that last book that you're trying to hammer in there, and I noticed that the row popped up in the center once they were jammed in there. And I thought, well, isn't that curious? But then it was about a year and a half later when this opportunity came up with the Athenaeum that, and really for me, I never made any drawings. I didn't do anything. It was just that was interesting to me. And then I had this opportunity, and I pitched the idea to them literally at the last minute. And I just said, you know, it's going to be like this and like that, like in the gallery. And so what I lacked for in preparation, I made up for with gesticulation and enthusiasm, and they bought it. They loved the idea. And then I had a panic attack on my way back to the studio because I realized I actually had to make it. So the idea was interesting, but I literally had no idea how I was going to actually do it. But the idea, and it's similar to some of the stuff I'm working on now, where I know what I'm going to do, but I don't necessarily know what it's going to look like. But that gets back to the conceptual aesthetic question. I have a pretty good idea that it's going to be visually really interesting. So I'm trying to think ahead to what it might look like. But it starts with that simple idea, and then I think about it over sometimes a year, 2 years, and there's always things in the back burner, little experiments that I'm doing that could turn into something if the opportunity is right. And that particular piece was great because I had the seed of the idea, but then the opportunity came, and it was perfect for that space. So I pursued it, but then it took an entire summer of book explosions and testing and tensioning systems. But I was dedicated to the concept. You know, I didn't want to fake it. A lot of people said, well, why don't you drill holes through all the books and put a cable through them and do it that way? And that, you know, that would just violate the integrity of the piece, because it's called John Henry. So it's about this physical act of attempting to do this. So the one thing that I said from the very beginning was that whatever it takes to make this happen is just going to be the piece. And so I didn't anticipate steel bracing. I didn't anticipate clamps. I didn't anticipate reverse keystones and shims, and all of those things were just developed in the process. And that's similar to some of the stuff that I'm doing now, where there is a drive toward a purity of the concept. So, but always understanding that the concept for me, or the aesthetic, flows from the concept naturally. But it's really, there's not a hierarchy there. It's really when they become indistinguishable. They support each other, and that's what I'm really after. Because in a way, you can't decipher which came first. But for me, it normally starts out in a simple way, and like that one. Isn't that curious? That's just kind of interesting, and it just percolates for a while until something comes of it. It's some sort of self-portrait, I suppose, but I've been calling it the Dymaxion self-portrait. I don't know if that'll be the final title, but Dymaxion, Buckminster Fuller coined that phrase. It was his word that he used for branding of several things that he did, like the Dymaxion car, the Dymaxion house, and the Dymaxion map. He did the first ever flat map of the globe that was undistorted, and it's kind of triangulated, you know. But what it shows when you unfold it that way, it gives you this new perspective, and where really it's like a big island that we live on. Everything's sort of connected when you look at it that way. So just taking something from 3D and looking at it in 2D really changes the way we see something. And so I'm interested in that as an experiment, really. But it came from there, but it also came out of the work that I've been doing with skin. The several pieces that I've made and I'm still making about the two-dimensional image becoming three-dimensional, where I'm using two-dimensional images and then extracting the skin from those images. So I've given myself a constraint of I'm using only really consumer images, so fashion and celebrity images. And then within those images, I'm taking out just the skin and using whatever is supplied to me in the image as the breaks for where that ends. So whether it's jewelry or a clothing item, and then I remove that piece of skin. And so in one sense, it's exploiting the two-dimensional nature of imagery, because it takes it and it remains two-dimensional, but now it's this thin membrane that's extruded into space. So now we can see it for its two-dimensional quality. Now it becomes this thin piece of paper. Instead of just something you observe, now it becomes something you touch. So it's really like skinning an image, and in that sense, it's connected to taxidermy and dissection and some other things like that. It's by using that constraint of two-dimensionality and trying to recognize the limitations of the two-dimensional image, that it's a fake two-dimensional representation of a real human being. So it's by bringing that into space that it exploits the limitations of what the two-dimensional image can do by bringing it into a different context. It dehumanizes them as well. So they're no longer individuals. It's put into this commodified pool of flesh, and it's all assembled together into something else, which I think it has become in the culture. This just the fact that the way we're bombarded by images of that type daily. It has an effect for men and women on the way we view our bodies and the bodies of those around us. Particularly with this commodification of women's bodies, that I think as a husband, as a dad of a daughter, that's probably forced me to think about those things in different ways. And when I think about, what she sees on TV and trying to help her grow up with a good self-image that's not just connected to how she looks. And in Southern California, it's really hard to do that. Taking a personal look at that. With gravitational radius, questioning, where are we with that issue in a cultural sense? I think stripping it down to where they're dehumanized and de-individualized, you recognize that this is all the same. It's all the same stuff. And we're surrounded by it every day. So there's this homogenizing effect that happens where there's nothing special about these images at all, regardless of who it is or the context. Now it's just an arm. And it's this dehumanized arm, but I think in that one piece there's just under 800 arms and legs. So it's a different way of exploitation, I guess, or it's exploring the issue of exploitation. Maybe it is exploiting it to a degree in and of itself. I kind of didn't really want to shave my head, but I really wanted it to be a record of the skin of my entire body, and so that's it's a pretty big area that's covered in hair. So I decided to shave, but also because the real thing that made me decide to go ahead and shave was that I was realizing how much hair really defines the individual, and so without my beard and my hair, I'm curious to see, particularly in a three-dimensional scan, if I even look anything like myself, or if I look more like sort of a generic human form. And early on, this piece was related to some of the taking apart and putting back together that started with a clementine in my studio, where I peeled the clementine and tried to stitch it back together, only to find out that Zoe Leonard had done it before, but that led to some other ideas that really propelled a body of work for a number of years. Several pieces I've loosely referred to as these resurrection parodies, where I've taken something, broken it down, then put it back together again, and focusing on this new thing that it becomes, which is often kind of like a Frankenstein version of its original self. Starting with the lamb piece that I created, where I butchered the lamb, had it butchered, and then stitched it back together. So you have the element of constraints. I was using only lamb. The head is formed out of ground lamb, but it was embracing the process of the butchering of the lamb, and then using the cuts that are available in a retail setting, and then trying to reform the lamb out of the retail available cuts. So, but in that particular piece, I thought it was really interesting that this kind of started this whole series of pieces with the lamb. I was interested in the religious symbolism of the lamb, but also the connection of that and the fact that the first ever cloned animal was Dolly, was a sheep. So I thought, given the significance of the lamb, particularly in Christianity and Judaism, was just a fascinating moment in the culture, that quote-unquote man-made animal. The first one was a lamb, was interesting. I still find that interesting. And that's my looking outside of our own world at the larger universe, and my own faith becomes an important component in that, how I see those things and how I see myself. And so faith is something that is integral to the work. For me, it's usually the work's not particularly devotional or a cynical approach toward religion. Usually it's the combination of the two. And when that you can't quite decipher, because that's, I have my own issues with some of the dogma from the church and organized religion, but yet it's a very important aspect of my life as well. So there's conflict that's just inherent, and I think that's pretty common among anybody that has a stake in religion, but also is a thinker, I suppose. You realize that there's so many layers to it, that there's good and bad, absolutely. But do you throw it out completely and forget it? Some people do. So it's complicated for me. That's a long answer to say it's complicated, and that's where usually where the work is coming from with when it deals with faith. It's usually in a more complicated way than that. So it's not even to say that I'm trying to. I have some message in mind. It's probably an expression, in a sense, of that doubt and questioning. I think it really deals with human brokenness, just kind of just a sense of human brokenness that we all feel. And so for me, that's directly connected to faith, and of course the resurrection parody has a layer of Christian reference in there. And how we deal with that brokenness, that we're very reluctant to admit it to our friends. We put on sort of an air of that we've got it all together, but in reality, that's not the reality that any of us deal with. Is that there's a lot of many different varieties of brokenness. Well, I've done pretty well on the collection process so far of all these different tapered vessels, but I've got to find a few key transitions and some sizes that I'm missing. So I'm out on the hunt now looking for some specifics. So right now we're going to hit a couple drug stores. I'm going to go to Rite Aid and Hillcrest first and see if I can get a urine specimen cup, because I just have to have one of those in the tower. particular piece is a giant tower
Uh-huh.
that starts out with a little plastic communion cup.
Wow.
And then it, like, you wedge a larger tapered cup into the smaller cup.
Uh-huh.
And so it goes to like a McDonald's creamer, then like a little bit bigger, then like a urine sample cup, and it goes like all the way up to the biggest brute Rubbermaid trash can.
Oh, okay.
And so in stages. So I've got it almost all done, but I've got certain transitions that are really hard to find.
Okay.
So yesterday I scored here and got a few really good. Oh wait, that's a really good. Some religious undertones, but it's really, I think it's about a bigger idea than just religion, but it's about sort of, being, well, in one sense, it's about consumption and sort of the supersize culture, but it's also about, not being satisfied, always looking for more, this idea of less is less, and accumulating, continually building up, and looking for more, always wanting more. And so I think in a broader sense, the piece is about that. But in a personal sense, it has something to do for me with communion, and there's those religious undertones in there. I think that's really what that piece is for me. It's like, taking that little cup, the little vessel, and filling the cup with a bigger cup, and then filling that cup with an even bigger cup, and then the process goes on and on and on. So it's this this idea of just never being satisfied, because the process just continues to go, and it also becomes this tower that's shooting up into the sky. It's kind of like a telescope. I think it references a lot of things, but I think really at its root, it's about being dissatisfied and the feelings that go along with that. So now 10 years later, I've gone back to that idea of just peeling a clementine. When you peel it in a spiral, the radius breaks in the middle of the sphere, and it becomes this spiral S, which I just think is interesting. So the flattening, which is connected to all this other work that I've done using the flat image and trying to explore what happens with the nature of the two-dimensional image as a representation of three-dimensional reality. thought, wouldn't that be interesting to apply that to the entire body and peeling and flattening the complex geometry of the entire body. And as a universal idea, this thing that we all share, from the Demaxian map to just simply unfolding a clementine, a transformation occurs and you can see something in a different way. What's that going to look like? And maybe what is that going to tell me about myself, tell me about the human form in general that we share. The first tests were just with rubber gloves, taking just regular kitchen rubber gloves and attempting to peel them and cut them apart and flatten them in one piece. And so it took a whole box of rubber gloves to get a couple tests that actually started to do something interesting. And it really, it makes these arabesque patterns, and it goes in a lot of different directions. And I thought it was really interesting. So coating the body was really going to be, that's what I initially thought was going to be the direction of the piece. And so I planned on shaving my body and coating it and then peeling it all off and then beginning the cutting process. And I wasn't really getting the results that I was looking for. And so, this, you can see how this, unfolding it starts to overlap onto itself. And so it's very difficult to flatten it so it doesn't overlap. Tried, all kinds of cutting techniques around some of the more complex, the nose and the mouth, and there's the chin right there, and that didn't work. I don't even know what that is. Latex. This was the first latex test, which you can see was just not very successful. I think this was my chest. I pulled this off my chest. This is a head actually, and I think it's about 20 feet long actually, but I just decided to do a ribbon, and so you can see it just goes around the head. There's a nose right there, and I had a lot of days with this piece that I felt like I was going backwards, because there's this initial idea of what I think this is going to look like, and I thought, oh, the rubber is going to work great. I did rubber gloves, I did some initial tests, and I just had this idea that it was going to be like, okay, yeah, I know where I'm going. I know what this is going to be like, and I had projected that pretty far out. And then you run up against a wall and you realize that this is a mess and it's just not working. It dawned on me that this is something that should be done digitally. This is really kind of an archaic way to do this when the technology exists to do this all digitally. I started just doing some online research and started reading about these Kinect cameras from the Xbox, the Xbox sensor from the Xbox 360. And there's, people are using them for everything right now. There are tons of people have hacked into these things and they're using them for just everything you can imagine, including art. A lot of people are using them for art making right now. So there's several pieces of software out there that turn it into a 3D scanner, and it looked like I could get the results from that I was looking for, but also I realized it was an interesting part of the piece for me, that it's an $80 camera that I can go buy at Radio Shack, and then I can just plug this in and download some software, and I've got a 3D scanner in my studio. It makes the piece more accessible. And to me, that's just directly related to looking back at, well, what's the overall constraint? What's the idea? What's the most important thing here? Removing any unnecessary information so I can really let the idea speak in a more clear way. And there was a much more efficient, and because of its efficiency, it's the way I look at it as a much more elegant solution to the problem. gets the process out of the way, and it allows the idea to come forward. The currency of two-dimensional imagery is all digital, and that's still a part of the piece to me, where objectification and two-dimensional imagery is connected to the digital process. When I talk about it being more elegant and more efficient, I'm talking about that the connection of aesthetic and concept, where I'm getting closer to that, where the two are indistinguishable, or it's getting close to that point where the two become indistinguishable. It's the three-dimensional form which is digitized, and that connects, of course, to Buckminster Fuller. I think that was one of the things too that pretty quickly piqued my interest with this piece, is that it's expressing the geometry of my body through triangulation is it's connected to Bucky. So that was one of the things I think that just sucked me right in pretty quickly. Like, okay, this is it. That's the direction I have to go. Now I'm doing the exact same thing that I was doing with the cutting, but now I'm doing it digitally. But it's a lot more efficient because I can find those overlaps, and so it gives me these flat pieces of mesh. But if you see how it unfolds, this is my thigh coming down here, and it's unfolding it this way. So you can see this over here relates to that right there. So that piece nests into there. So that would wrap around and actually nest into there. That will give me a vector file, which I can have laser cut. Looking at the work that I've made over the last 10 years, I think one thing that I see in common, because often material is not common, I've used a lot of different materials over the years, but I'm often drawn to work that is, you could really explain what it is physically, usually in one sentence. And so that it may be extraordinarily complex or technically difficult to make. There may be thousands of pieces, but you could essentially explain, like John Henry, for example, 40-foot long row of books pressed between two walls. It's a very simple task that I've done. It may be very difficult to make it happen. So I like the simplicity and the elegance of a simple idea. So with John Henry, people can walk in and just say, wow, and then walk out and see what's happening. But then hopefully it stays with you, and it percolates over time. So I'm very interested in the implications. In fact, I think about Andy Warhol's soup cans. It's so simple, I made paintings of soup cans, But so you can explain what it is in one sentence. But then, what I think about with that piece is that, you look at the different flavors, and I think about, my mom making casseroles with cream of mushroom soup, and I think about tomato soup and grilled cheese, and maybe it's lost the currency of contemporary culture. I don't think it's as ubiquitous as it once was when that piece was first made, but there's a shared experience. When I look at that piece, I'm thinking about my stories and being at home with my family and kind of the comfort of that. But yet you realize that the people standing next to you looking at it essentially have the same stories. So it's about the implications of that simple statement in an art context it's extraordinary. That piece is still challenging to me, the way it just marked that moment in history. And so I think I'm after that, and I'm after that breaking down of the idea of the individual, which I think that piece did it so well, still does it. But I don't mean that in I don't necessarily think that's a depressing thing, to think, well, I've just lost my identity as an individual. I think it's actually more of a comforting thing that we actually have more in common with the people around us, that we have these shared stories. I'm interested in more these universal ideas, those experiences that I have that make me realize that the world is a lot bigger than me, and my own likes and dislikes and the things that I surround myself with. My latest fascination with astrophysics is an example of that too. To really look outside, not just look outside of my own self, but look outside of our own Earth and our own galaxy, and really gives you a sense of feeling small. But I think there's kind of a peace in that as well. It can make your own problem seem small. I grew up an art kid, so I was never went through any advanced math classes, failed algebra the first time. And so I was convinced at a pretty early age that I wasn't any good at math, which I think was unfortunate in hindsight, because I'm fascinated by math. And it's just a different way of looking at the world around you. And so making some of these new pieces about time and mortality, but with that same the idea of constraints, thinking about our own lifespan as a constraint. Omega Man, trillion-second countdown. This idea of a trillion, of 1 trillion, and the abstract nature of a large number like that is something that we can't really get our heads around. In one sense, it's just an attempt to capture that. What does a trillion really mean? So it was interesting in thinking about, 1 trillion seconds ago, 1 trillion seconds in the past, the last known Neanderthals were still walking around the plains of Europe. So really dealing with the dawn of civilization as we know it 1 trillion seconds ago. So that kind of puts things into perspective. Now we're sort of on the downward slope. So 1 trillion seconds from now, something is going to happen. So it's making a prediction that's arbitrary in a sense, but it can't be verified, because when 1 trillion seconds is 31,688 years, so it's essentially 32,000 years in the future. So really nobody can say that it's not accurate, because it can never be verified. And it's also, I think it's referencing, prophecies, like every couple of years there's always some jackass, giving some specific time about, the end of the earth or something like that. And then of course when it doesn't happen, then we've got to recalculate and didn't get the math quite right. And then there's a new one that you throw out there. So if you throw it out 32,000 years into the future, then there's a sense that there's even more credibility to it because it can never be verified. It's hard to go after a big universal idea in a big universal way. I think it's easier to go the opposite way, to be more personal. And that's where it can either become narcissistic if you get too personal and self-reflective, or there's potential for it to be deeply universal, the more personal the work becomes. I'd been thinking about this piece for a while, sort of in a parallel track to Omega Man. The time that we as human beings have on this earth, if you compare it to a larger number like the age of the universe or something like that, we do essentially have the same amount of time on this earth. So it is one thing that connects us all. Genetically speaking, we're nearly identical to each other. The time that we have is nearly the same, with some little differences. So it is something that connects us. To get at that broader theme, that more universal theme.
How can we take predictive modeling? How can we take just estimating when someone's going to die, and applying it in the art sense that really makes a difference and I guess it bridges the gap between formulaic-driven results to creative expression.
This is a piece that I think, to get to that point, it goes deeper into the most specific and the most intimate research into, how long do you actually have on this earth, down to the second.
We call it actuarial science, and I think sometimes it is art too, because it's predictive modeling. When you think about putting it in the context of how many seconds do I have from when I set this information to when I'm expected to die, it kind of brings the fullness of life into perspective.
The program start date for the first one is my birth certificate, and with even the time of birth, which I was able to get from the records of the state of New Jersey. And then the programmed end dates, counting down to the number that we've come up with from the calculator that we've developed.
You can see these seconds ticking away, and what kind of choices am I making in life?
I think that's where making it so personal to me was really interesting, because if a collector wants to buy the piece, then it would be programmed with their information.
And I don't think to me, it's not a morbid thing. I mean, it is a little bit eerie. The first time, David and I were talking about this, the first time that I actually got a number to come up.
There's something that's interesting to me about that, because in a way, it removes it from the typical art context.
When I look at that and say, okay, if I was buying this piece and putting it in my house, what would it tell me every day? It would be a constant reminder of, are you living your life kind of to the fullest?
I think most artists make things, we put this stuff out into the world with the hope that it will last, it will outlast us, that it will somehow be accepted into a cultural history, and it will be valued, and it will continue. So there is kind of a connection to our own mortality, I think, in a deeper sense, about sort of why people make art. This one it's designed to not outlive the owner.
I think about this with my daughter, that at some point her heart wasn't beating and it started beating. It's like this clock. At some point, the number just showed up in the number of seconds, and I had my information in there, and it's kind of like, oh wow, I only have this many seconds to live. Being in midlife now, and having young kids and seeing them grow up so fast and time just flying by, you start to think about your time a little bit differently. When you're really young, you sort of feel invincible, and you don't think about those things because it seems endless. It seems like you have this endless amount of time left. And then there's something about
midlife, where you do start to think about mortality. And so, but I think that's usually what art does, is it takes some intangible concept and gives it a visual and communicates in a way that another form of expression can't do as effectively. So it's giving that idea a visual, to see that time always just evaporating.
If you went back into that space. Yeah.
The art making, the art showing, that's just a part of it. I'm 40 now. I'm not a superstar, by any measure. You go through the museums and you see art stars that are, with their year of birth far younger than me. That's not my motivation. I think I've come to realize that just the life of being an artist, the creative life, is a very interesting and fulfilling life. And with artist friends and being a part of an artist community, and just a way of looking at life and having opportunities to be in the studio and make work, and there's a lot of joy that comes out of that, and I find it very, very interesting and engaging. And so my motivation, I think when you're in grad school and you hear all these stories about these people getting picked up right out of grad school by the big blue chip gallery and becoming overnight success, and there was that time when you're in grad school, you kind of get your head filled with those ideas, and you have some friends that's happening to, and it didn't happen for me. I came back to San Diego kind of after that amazing experience, and okay, you got to start making work again, and nobody's looking and nobody cares. And so you start doing it, and you have to figure out a way to incorporate that into your life. I have 2 great kids and wife and a really great life, and art is just sort of incorporated into that. It's a part of my life. In grad school, their heads get filled with it's either art star or nothing, and there's actually a lot in between. If you kind of have a different perspective and different expectations of what a life of being an artist and making art is going to provide for you. And I talk to my students about this all the time. You can never expect art to support your life. You have to structure your life to support art. It's trying to find that balance, because it's really more about putting together a creative and interesting and fulfilling life without sacrificing all of these other things that I care about deeply.